Over to you, Naomi.
Thank you, Amelia. And just before I start, just to say, with the way I've got this set up, I won't be able to see any questions in the chat. So do interrupt me, Amelia, if there are things that you think I should address as I go. And then once I stop sharing my slides, I'll be able to pick those up. So hi, I am Naomi Chapman. I'm a senior consultant at New Philanthropy Capital, or NPC. And NPC is a think tank and consultancy for the social sector. So we do lots of work directly with charities and funders, helping them with things like their strategy development, helping funders work out where to spend their money and the best processes for doing that, for example. And in my role, I largely work with charities on their new strategies. The examples I've given of what NPC do is basically what I do. I help charities develop their new strategies, and I help funders work out the most inclusive and transparent ways of giving money, but also kind of the best causes to support and the best ways of supporting those causes. So that's a little bit about New Philanthropy Capital, and we're really glad to have been invited by Voluntary Norfolk here today to kind of start this workshop and then contribute to the discussion after a short presentation. The cost of living came up for NPC, or coming up to a year ago now. We were there was news stories were starting. We were thinking this is a massive wave on the horizon that is approaching the social sector. And it felt to us in kind of spring 2022 that it was looming, but everyone kind of wanted to ignore the fact that it was coming, because everyone was quite tired and a lot had been happening. And we felt that we needed to put in place responses before that wave kind of crashed over the sector, as we anticipated that it would over the winter, once kind of the worst impacts of inflation and the worst impacts of it just being cold and energy prices having its significant impact would hit. So we started mobilizing in kind of May and June last year, thinking about how can we support charities through our think tank work to respond to the cost of living crisis. And that started primarily with a publication that we did that was targeted at funders. So this was very much on the cost of living crisis nationally. It was called Confronting the Cost of Living Crisis. And this was advice to funders on what they should be doing about this thing that was approaching the sector. And we were really trying to encourage the same mobilization from funders that we saw in March 2020, where we saw this brilliant, overnight funders were saying, we'll take away these restrictions, we'll launch these emergency funds. And we just weren't seeing that last summer. And we really wanted to be, because we saw the cost of living crisis as big a crisis as COVID, and potentially even bigger. And so while this was a resource for funders, it was grounded in the conversations that we have through all of the work that we do with charities of all shapes and sizes. So kind of on any given day at NPC, there's about 50 of us, and most of us will speak to a handful of charities every day. So we get this kind of constant flow of intelligence from the sector, but we also did some targeted interviews with charities working in different spaces of different kind of sizes and scopes. And what we tried to do was really distill the common trends that we saw affecting the charity sector, and then use those to inform our recommendations for what funders should be doing to respond. So I don't think, just a caveat, this report was published in July 2022. So a lot of this you'll be going, well, yeah, that's obvious, but no one was really saying this at the time. And so we just wanted to make really clear what the effects on charities were going to be. So those were grouped in kind of 4 key areas. The first 3 we sort of articulated as coming together to be a triple bind for charities, a really kind of fatal combination. So rising operating costs, most specifically for food, energy, petrol, payroll. This report came out before the government put in place any kind of energy support for either charities or for households. But, even with those support schemes, this has still been the case. We've seen third sector charity staff on strike over pay, and whilst lots of charities have responded with kind of uplifts, it's not really been, we've not, as a sector, been able to afford the kind of uplift that would see us keep pace with inflation. Falling donations and volunteering. I'm sure this chimes with many of your experiences as organisations. Charities were already seeing in the summer, and we're anticipating real reductions in both financial donations and in kind support. So we spoke to a baby bank, for example, that was seeing their donations of secondhand goods massively fall as people move to kind of sell stuff on Facebook Marketplace and earn a little bit more money from what they had sitting around, rather than where they might previously have passed it on. Similarly, food banks, when the cost of adding something to your weekly shop becomes higher, people were just stopping doing that. And also falling volunteering. We were seeing that kind of across the sector. as people picked up more paid work or just couldn't foot the costs of taking part, where charities might not be able to support volunteer expenses, or where the kind of expense reimbursement didn't meet the kind of up-to-date cost of providing that support. So those are the kind of two, we have rising operating costs, we have falling donations, and then all brought together with increased demand. And I'm sure you've all seen this across your charities in the last year, but kind of a huge expansion in demand for frontline services. Yesterday, I think the Trust of Trusts announced 37% increase in the number of food parcels they've given out year on year. That's an enormous expansion in demand, and we've really seen an expansion in the audiences that charities are having to support, not just into new territories. So we see those headlines around NHS staff having to use food banks, but also a real kind of complexity of demand. So whereas someone might have had a relatively straightforward need previously, they're now coming with multifaceted, really complex need that's much more difficult for charities to tackle. And then the fourth point here is slightly kind of sits slightly apart from the other three, but we really felt that across the charities that we were speaking to this time last year, leaders were really under strain, and that any kind of funder response had to really acknowledge the fact that charity leaders were just kind of beginning to catch their breath after COVID. They were trying to support a really burnt out workforce, and they were facing the pressures of lots of individually really vital things like the climate crisis, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But all of those things at once were creating real pressure on charity trustees, charity leaders, and all throughout the management of organisations. So this was kind of our distillation of what was happening to charities under the cost of living crisis. And we use this to essentially have a call to action for funders to give more, uplift their grants, give more, pay out a larger amount of their endowment if they're lucky enough to have one, to give better, so to remove restrictions, to change their processes so that accessing funding was more easy for charities, and to give differently, so to look at how need was shifting in their local area or in the area that they supported, and to kind of reallocate their funding portfolios. And so we launched this in July, and we saw a really good response from funders. We definitely didn't see the mobilization at the scale that we would have liked to have seen, but we did see kind of individual funders take this up. We saw a lot of our philanthropy clients at MPC kind of agree to the recommendations, uplift their grants by 10%. And I hope that kind of everyone on this call has had at least one funder have that conversation, at least, even if they're not able to match the ambition of the recommendations that we were making. So that was kind of our perception of the impacts of the cost of living crisis nationally. And we also did a bit of work thinking about how that might be different rurally, including for this blog that you can have a look at on our website. We kind of spoke to several charities working in rural Shropshire and said, are these things still true for you? And essentially, yes, and potentially yes, and it's kind of worse here. So for rising operating costs, we heard charities say that actually, energy bills are higher. We need more fuel to get around because we're geographically disparate. Often, people aren't on mains gas, or their water supply is different, and so the costs were different, or they weren't being able to access energy support schemes. For falling donations and volunteering, again, volunteers live further from where they might be trying to work, and so they really were seeing that plummet. There might be less easy access to public transport to access where charities were based. And for increasing demand, I'm sure many of you kind of reflect that rural communities are often also lower wage economies, there's high food insecurity, and that there's less easy access to kind of the centralised services that urban hubs provide. And finally, there's an interesting one to reflect on kind of whether there was a difference in the strain that leaders were under at a rurally compared to the national picture. And I'd be interested in anyone's reflections from the group, but we kind of felt that it was probably quite similar, but there was potentially just less kind of support, less leaders in those areas were less networked in, potentially. And I'd be really happy to be challenged on that if that's not how you feel the picture is in Norfolk. And I think it's why things like this are so valuable for the sector. So that's kind of national level, rural level. And what we did, so we had our recommendations for funders, but what we also included within that, although this guide was for a funder audience, we wanted to include some recommendations for kind of how charities should be responding. And this was framed as, oh, you're this funder, what should you be encouraging in the charities that you fund? What's good behavior, what's good response to this massive crisis. But we also were mindful, and I used to be a fundraiser, you know, that when you put out any kind of guidance for funders, you will often get charities reading it and saying, what are they saying? And so we wanted to kind of use it to potentially nudge some of the things that we thought charities should be doing. And we didn't, I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, because I think a lot of these, you know, not going to labour the point of why you should kind of try to strengthen your income or review expenditure. But I wanted to use today to talk about this fifth point around being kind of agile and collaborative with data. Because this was potentially one of the less obvious or less popular recommendations within the guide. And what we're looking at here is being agile with data. That's things like being really clear on what the metrics you're using are to track the effects of the cost of living crisis on your charity's operations, on its impact, and then also being really clear on where there are thresholds that are going to instill a decision in your work. So when we reach this point, if we hope we don't get there, but if we do, that's the point where we're going to make this decision, and kind of doing that thinking. Bear in mind, this is all July last year, doing that thinking in advance of hitting those points so that you've done it whilst you have the headspace and not whilst you're in that immediate crisis situation. And around being collaborative with data, this was really trying to encourage charities to work together and talk, and it builds into the point above about working with others, but to kind of set up ways of sharing data, whether it's in a local area or within a cause area, to understand the need to allow all charities in that space to kind of better target responses and be more kind of agile in that regard. And so that was the kind of bit that when Amelia asked me to come in and speak on kind of how does Norfolk compare to the national picture, this was kind of my challenge to the group and to myself was, you know, where do you start with answering that question? Like if you're a charity, as you all are working in Norfolk, how do you know how Norfolk compares to the national picture, and how do you know the localized needs that you need to be responding to? So I wanted to therefore use this as a little bit of a chance to show you something that is free on the MPC website that might be useful to you all in kind of answering this question on an ongoing basis. So thinking about data, data is brilliant, you know, it allows you to really understand the need in your local area, helps you to learn from the experiences you have, to identify patterns and trends that might either challenge or confirm the assumptions you're making about the people you're supporting or about the effectiveness of your services. And if you share your data, you're bringing your peers, your competitors, some might say, closer together, and you're hopefully allowing, you know, better understanding of need, better learning from experience, and better understanding of trends at a sector level, not just at an organizational level. And so thinking about that question of how Norfolk compares to the national picture, so coming out of our COVID response, we were saying we wanted there to be a tool, a way, and looking at the left-hand side of this, the left-handmost chevron on this slide, we wanted there to be a way for charities to be able to easily navigate all of the amazing data that is out there in the sector. So, you know, there are official statistics, lots of charities hold a lot of data, and we wanted to bring that all together. And we thought that by kind of sharing data and presenting that in a way that's digestible and easy for even the smallest of charities to navigate, that we would then be able to kind of support the things that are on this slide moving towards the right. So, you know, charities could use that data and then combine it with their own experiences, their staff and user insights. They could come together with other charities to kind of do that collectively and analyze the situation, and then hopefully make better decisions, have a better understanding of the situation. So what we came up with in 2020, when we thought that this would be a helpful kind of tool for the sector, was our local needs databank. And so this is on the MPC website. You can Google it now and have a play around whilst I'm talking. But it was created to help charities and funders better understand needs in communities around the UK. And as I was saying, it was created due to the large amounts of data that existed telling us about the kind of health and needs of local areas, but being really disparate, really hard to bring together without kind of trawling through lots of ONS pages, for example. So this is our kind of solution to that problem. And And we bring together there over 50 indicators of kind of local need. So we've got some official statistics from census data on kind of age, deprivation, health, ethnicity, for example, and then charity demand data from some of our partner organisations. So as I say, please, as I'm saying all of this, do open another tab, have a play around, because I just think it's really fun and you'll quickly get your head around it and potentially, hopefully, see a way that it might be useful to your organisation. But the first thing you'll see when you get there are these pre-made reports on particular topics. And some of my colleagues think these are the best bit. Maybe I'll be told off for saying this. I personally prefer some of the other functionality, but if you are just an organisation that works with children and young people, then potentially this is the best place for you to start. What I prefer is our explore and compare feature. And what this allows you to do is build a really bespoke dashboard to your charity in the area that you're working in. And so if we're trying to understand how Norfolk compares to the national picture for a particular issue, we can easily build that data set from this feature. So in the first step, you're asked to either choose a specific local authority or a region, or choose a level of deprivation if you want to see all of the regions in that one. But for you, it would probably be step 1A, and you can see here, I've selected kind of the east of England as a region, but you can choose Norfolk similarly as a local authority. And then in step 2, you're invited to kind of select the measures that are most relevant to your organisation. And I put some examples of the kinds of measures we have here, but if you're a child poverty organisation or a breakfast club, let's say, you might have a look at child poverty statistics. You might be interested in how many people in Norfolk are working full time and might, be wanting to access a breakfast club as a childcare provision. You might be trying to understand the size of the under 5 population, let's say, if that's your beneficiary range. And so what you can do is kind of select the really specific measures that you're interested in. And then what it does is output a report. And I don't know how good the quality of this image is, but hopefully you can see we've got Norfolk, we've got the local authorities within that. And then we've got some of these indicators that I've chosen. These are fairly random. I think you'd have to try quite hard to design the charity that these 6 are going to be useful for, but potentially, you never know, these are the 6 someone might choose. And so you can really see, and this might help you decide to target a service in a particular local part of Norfolk. So, I've got this service for children in poverty, and so actually I'm going to be looking in Norwich and in Great Yarmouth, because those are the areas with the highest prevalence. Or I've got this intervention that supports the reduction of child obesity, and so actually I'm looking in Great Yarmouth and Breckland, for example. And hopefully by kind of playing around with that, you can output a report that's useful or that potentially challenges some of the assumptions or confirms some of your views on the area that you're working in within Norfolk. And so the sense is that this tool is helpful for the kind of leftmost part of that chevron. So it brings together data. This isn't going to be enough alone. We'd want you to combine this with your staff expertise, with your user voice, with speaking to others and doing that collective sense making, but that this provides a kind of really valuable tool for some of those conversations. The other way you can look at things is at a local authority summary level. In case this might be useful. So this is all of the data for North Norfolk. And essentially what you're looking at here is, if you're a number 1, you're the best local authority in the country for this. Sometimes it's weird because it's a negative thing. So you're actually the worst. You have to just read across the rows to kind of see what that means. But so what's interesting is actually North Norfolk, you're one of, as a local authority, has some of the most per capita, you have a very high number of charities. There's a lot of charities working in this space. So there should be real opportunities for collaboration and really shows the importance of kind of infrastructure bodies like Voluntary Norfolk, and relative to, there's kind of a line down the middle here, which is sort of, you're right in the middle of the pack, but you've also got kind of higher rates of fuel poverty, higher rates of child poverty, for example, from this display. At South Norfolk, you can see it's a slightly different picture. Still got, I've picked 2 random things here. You've still got higher charity density. You're towards the right of this. Got more people working in the public sector, which probably isn't surprising, but that might help you understand the different need. And this data might help with prioritization in your organization when times get hard. Often I'm definitely guilty of this as a trustee of a rural charity, of I pick up on a national trend, and I don't necessarily always know if that is actually an issue in Devon where the charity's based, but this gives you that understanding of actually how much is this national trend going to affect us in the local area that we're working in. Okay, that was a very whistle-stop tour through lots of different ways that you can use the Databank to slice the data. It's worth saying that we've updated the data that goes into this Databank since 2020, but we've not overhauled the overarching structure of it, but that is in progress. So if you're playing around, hopefully you find a way that it's useful. If you have any comments or feedback on it, then do get in touch, because we are in the process of updating all of this. And so we'd love any user input. Just going to skip past these slides. These are just ways you can see the Trust or Trust data, the Turn to Us data, the data we have from our charity partners, which might be interesting. And come to my final slide, because I'm very sick of the sound of my own voice. Just to remind you that, as I was saying, this is a tool that we hope is really useful for the leftmost chevron on this slide. We really encourage all charities to use it and tell us how to make it better, as I say, but also do bring this in with your own data. Use your staff, use your user voice to really understand how does Norfolk differ from the national picture. We've got this data, but we need to blend that with other sources of insight. And also the third one here of collective sense making, come together on a local scale to understand the situation and analyze what needs to be done, like we are today. So I'm going to stop sharing and allow you guys to discuss, but I'd be really interested to hear what you think Norfolk's unique challenges are. What impacts have we missed? Is there anything that's affecting Norfolk that's not captured nationally or with our rural analysis? How might this data be useful? And how can we build on the data that we have to make sense at a local level of the situation and target our responses? That's a lot of questions, but I am genuinely really, really interested to hear all of your thoughts. So I will just stop sharing. And if I can do that, bear with me, and allow you to ask any questions or jump in to the discussion. Great.